Okay, so welcome everybody to Genocide Awareness Week here at ASU. We're very pleased to have you. And let's get started.
We're having too much fun talking about our friends.
That's important. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Volker Benkert. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and it is my pleasure to moderate this panel, not as if any of the panelists need moderation, but I'm just there to throw ideas around. And I would like to welcome three wonderful scholars. Let me start with Henry right here next to me. Henry Theriault is Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Worcester State University. After teaching in its philosophy department from 1998 to 2017, and he's been a vice president since, and he's also served as chair of the philosophy department. So he's a distinguished scholar as well as a very high-ranking university administrator. He coordinated the university's Center for the Study of Human Rights from 1999 to 2007, and he has spoken and published widely on mass violence against women and girls and genocide perpetration, denial, victim-perpetrator relations, and prevention. He was lead author of Resolution with Justice, the report of Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group from 2015, with Samuel Totten, another very distinguished scholar in our field. He co-authored the United Nations Genocide Convention and Introduction with the University of Toronto Press in 2019. He has also served as International Association of Genocide Scholars President from 2017 to 2021. And since 2013, he has been founding and co-editor of Genocide Studies International, and he co-edited Genocide Studies and Prevention from 2007 and to 2012. So we have a distinguished administrator, a distinguished scholar, and someone who has done a lot for the field in enabling others to publish in it. So maybe I can welcome you first, and then I will introduce the other speakers.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Check is in the mail for the introduction. Thank you. Yeah, it makes me sound, if my kids could hear this, they would be laughing. But no, I appreciate it, and just really appreciate the Genocide Awareness Week. I think this is a really special program. I've been here fewer than 24 hours and already had some really exposure to some really groundbreaking work in the field that I find very engaged with some real problems, both in terms of our understanding of genocide, but also, and I think this is really important, about prevention in the future. And I've been taking a lot, copious notes and really learning a lot. So I appreciate that tremendously. And I'm excited to be with my distinguished co-panelists to talk about the issue of denial and maybe more than denial. So the first thing I'm going to do is be very clear. You will hear again and again and again, and even Elie Wiesel, and for good reasons, but even though I disagree with him on this, says this a lot, or said this a lot during his life. Denial is the final stage of genocide. There are two problems with that. Well, there's three problems with that. One is, I really don't like stage theories of genocides because they set up a really false way in which we try to organize cases of mass violence and really set up a way of excluding cases that don't fit with the stage theory. And there are different stage theories that are all over the place. And there are a lot of problems with this idea of the way genocides progress. Genocides we talk about uniqueness, right? Genocides are always very specific in how they operate. Yeah, there are commonalities, but once we get wedded to a particular model, we start missing the subtleties. And often for particular cases, we just heard about the Assyrian genocide, along with the Armenian genocide and Greek genocide, genocide of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Those kinds of cases get excluded because of these kinds of big supermodels, I'll call them. So we have to be really careful about that. But if there is a stage theory, the final stage is not denial. It's what I've called consolidation. And that is the point at which the impact of a genocide becomes so normalized and established in both material, cultural, or material and conceptual terms, including cultural and so forth, that there's no going back. What I mean by that is typically the victim group cannot become revitalized to have an extension in time into the future. And the material impact of the genocide, typically land theft, material theft, but also other political consolidation and so forth, has gone to a point where it can't get turned back. And for me, that's the moment of, I mean, genocides are sad. That's the moment when there's nothing that you can do. Denial happens throughout genocide. It happens during genocides. It happens after genocides. And Fatima Muge Göçek, who's a Turkish scholar who's done some work on the Armenian genocide, hesitates a little sometimes to call it a genocide, not because she doesn't agree that it fits that description, but because of political issues. But she's written a copious tome that shows how denial of violence against Armenians well pre-existed the Armenian genocide and was a causal factor in that process. And I picked up that idea. I think it's a great idea. And we see it again and again in the kinds of ways in which pre-genocidal violence becomes so important. So anyway, denial is not a final stage of genocide. It's everywhere. And we need to understand just how powerful an issue it is. I do not have time to go into the case of, the sort of history of denial of the Armenian genocide, and along with it, genocide of Greeks and Assyrians in the Ottoman Empire. Although the Armenian case has been the focus of the Turkish government and most of the scholarship of denial. And there are reasons for that may be complicated, but I think part of it is the size of the Armenian population relative to the Greek population, the Assyrian population. The fact that the Armenian case is a particular threat to Turkey because it involves territory within Turkey and a large enough territory and a consolidated enough territory that I think there's a real concern about the future. You have had an Armenian Republic for 30 years. There are a lot of things that with the Assyrian case, a stateless people that's more fragmented in terms of different religious groups and so forth, doesn't represent for the Turks. So I think they focus on the Armenian case as the particular concern, but deny all three together, if I can say it that way. That is, there's no, if Assyrians start pushing, the denial will be stepped up. I mean, if they start getting an effect, and you heard about Arizona and other states passing recognition resolutions of the Assyrian genocide, if that continues, you will see increased denial of the Assyrian genocide as well as it becomes more of a threat. So I think that's just to give an idea of why that focus on the Armenian genocide is important. I won't go into the background of the Armenian genocide. I'm going to assume a basic knowledge. Is that okay to do? Okay. But just say that really denial, as we talked about before, if you're talking about post-genocide denial, it happens right away. It happens more as omission in the 20s and 30s. And active efforts at omission. So for instance, MGM Studios was going to make a film based on the 40 Days of Musaada, which was written by a Jewish guy, Franz Werfel. It was a hugely important book in the 1930s, was banned by Nazi Germany, actually, because of the fear that this would give ideas to Jews. It was a book that people like Yera Aron have talked about circulating in different ghettos during the Holocaust as a sort of call to resistance. So when this starts to get some momentum, 1939, I believe it was, the Turkish government intervenes in Hollywood and prevents the film from being made. So this gives you an idea. That's where you start to get more active efforts at denial. And then by the 1960s, you have a 50th anniversary of 1915. You have Armenians around the world protesting, and you start to have both a formal political movement towards recognition and reparations and a backlash against that by the Turkish state and by scholars, I will call them mercenary scholars, for either career interests, financial interests, or ideological interests around the Cold War and so forth that join into this movement globally. So we have the beginnings of a very established state-sponsored, which is different from, well, I won't say it's different from the Holocaust. It used to be different from the Holocaust. It's not so much anymore. And certain other cases where you have a massive program of denial. Millions of US, I think of it this way, give a lot of aid to Turkey in different forms. 3 million of that or so a year, maybe more, comes back to the US for public relations firms and all sorts of other sort of nefarious denial activities. So we get to pay for our own denial. This campaign went through the 70s and 80s. It was became very academic in nature, and by that I mean there was an attempt to control academic discourse on the Armenian issue. And in the 90s, a huge battle back and forth. By the 2000s, that academic control that Turkey had, and we won't get into all the complexities of critical thinking, manipulations, and so forth, that allowed their denialist positions to get taken seriously by what I would hope to have been more thoughtful academics in all sorts of circles, were advanced. But by the 2000s, things start to shift. And by the 2010s, the scholarship is overwhelming. Doesn't mean that denial isn't happening, as Turkish government has institutes now, Armenian studies and all these kinds of things to promote denial. But the effectiveness of this has waned outside of Turkey. And we can talk about US recognition, we can talk about scholarly consensus. I would even argue that at times the Armenian genocide, because it involved all 5 of the methods of the UN definition of genocide, gets used as a reference case because it's able to deal with a lot of aspects of other cases of genocide. So it's a useful tool in that way. But that doesn't mean denial is not important. But what I'm going to now suggest are 2 reasons why denial really matters now. Am I okay for time? Okay. So the first thing is, and I want to be really clear about this, and I think even in the case of the Holocaust, you see this in different places. I think you see in contemporary Poland, you see some of the results of this, and we'll have I think a really important talk later on today, actually, right, if I'm not mistaken, about this issue. Genocides, when they end, they don't end. Okay. And we can talk about all the ways in which genocides continue in different ways. We can go from 19th century in the US, direct military genocide against Native Americans, to the boarding schools, to assassination of American Indian movement leadership in the 1970s. We can look at all sorts of continuations. But there's something we sometimes forget to look at, and that's what is happening with perpetrator states. And very, very rarely, and I would argue even in Germany, this was an incomplete process. Very rarely do you actually rehabilitate a perpetrator society so that you root out the ways in which a genocidal process, we focus a lot on what it does to victims, but we have to remember what it does to perpetrators. And they're not victims. I want to go away from that idea that, oh, we feel bad, perpetrators are victimized by genocide just as much as victims are. They're not. They can be coerced. There can be all sorts of horrible dynamics within perpetrator societies. But the point I'm making is the way in which societies that commit genocide develop is around a genocidal project, an ideology, and so forth. And these get embedded in state institutions, educational institutions, the military, the culture. Okay, we can see this. I mean, look at the US. We're just coming to terms with like sports team names that are denigrating to Native Americans, right? Our sports culture was organized around genocide. I mean, this is really significant. And unless a lot is done, and it has to be willingly done by perpetrator groups, but also there needs to be a lot of external help and support and challenge and so forth, and I've never really seen it done, does a society overcome this deep embedding of more than a genocidal mentality, the institutionalization of genocide. So if we look at the Turkish Republic, keep in mind the Armenian genocide, the genocide of Greeks and Assyrians goes into the 1920s. It's a common misconception that the end of the Ottoman Empire, end of World War I, stops that. Armenians in 1919 were massacred when trying to return to their lands, when they thought everything was safe because the Ottoman Empire was gone. You have the destruction of Smyrna in the early 1920s, where Greeks primarily, but also Armenians and others were targeted as a final attempt to sort of rid the Ottoman Empire of these quote unquote foreign or unassimilable elements, and all sorts of other things. That's important because it's the Turkish national movement, not the Ottoman Empire, that's perpetrating the second stage of genocide. And that shows that's important for 2 reasons. One, it sort of puts this process into the formation of the Turkish Republic we have today. And the second part of that is it sort of recycles or takes in genocide perpetrators into that new state and their project. And you could look at, key deniers in the 1950s in Turkey and so forth. They were perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, but they were parliamentary leaders, 30 years later. So when you start to see how embedded this is, we start to understand what is at stake with denial. A big part of denial is denial in Turkey, right? Preventing a transformation of that society. And you see fractures in Turkey. You've seen this. I think part of Erdogan's sort of right-wing totalitarian or at least authoritarian turn was in response to a lot of the political activism that was happening in Turkey around Armenian genocide, but around other issues as well, around the Kurdish question and so on. And this became a real problem in Turkey. A lot of progressive activists were pushing for democratization and a new look at minority groups and the history of the Ottoman Empire in ways that were really challenging a lot of the myths of Turkish identity. And it is very important, and I think this is true of the US as well, that personal identity through educational systems, through cultural forces and so forth, personal identity in Turkey, and I think I'll say this again, if you look at the last few years in the US, but even going before that, intentionally is very tied to a sense of national identity and a particularly bad sense of national identity that has, we think of Edward Westerman's great talk yesterday, toxic masculinity is a part of it, colonialist attitudes, elitist attitudes, power, all these kinds of things. And in Turkey, the threat of the truth of history is a direct threat to a sense of personal identity because it's a threat to national identity. And it's a big part of denial today is to stop change in Turkey and stop an accounting. At the same time, it's also these other reasons. Like 1 more minute is okay, please? Okay, I'm sorry, I don't mean to. I can go for 3 hours without a breath and no one wants that. So trust me, my students will tell you. And I know for those at home on Zoom, it's even worse. But so anyway, when we're thinking about this kind of situation, and again, you can look at Turkey, you can look at other post-genocide societies, look at the legacy of so-called communists, even today, who were the victims in 1965 of the Indonesian government. And today, it's still the culture of hatred against these groups. Their children, their grandchildren are still stigmatized, even pariahs in some cases. And around the world, we can see this again and again in different cases where there's been no rehabilitative process. And as I've said, I would say even Germany didn't really go through it enough. It went through a partial process, but there are a lot of people who escaped responsibility for their role in the Holocaust, particularly when they were not so Nazi, right? When they had corporate interests and so forth. And there's a whole, scholars far greater than I have written great things about this that I learned from. So without that transformation, right, we're in a bad situation. And denial, I would argue, is one of the methods, not the only method. I think raw political power. You can think of Turkey's role in the Cold War and now the very complicated situation of Turkey. I think Turkey is benefiting tremendously from the Ukraine invasion by Russia in terms of its renewed sort of value to the US, even though Russia and Turkey, I think their relations right now, and we'll talk about that in a second, are at a very high point that's, I think, very dangerous. We can start to see, sort of raw politics, all these kinds of things that work together with denial. What does that mean in terms of this legacy of the 1915 genocide? What it means is in 2020, I'll tell you where my mind is at. See, Sabri Atman just said, something that happened 100 years ago is as if it happened just now, and I guess I'm doing the same thing. And there's a little truth to that. In 2020, Turkish troops could go in to an area in Nagorno-Karabakh Republic or Artsakh and kill Armenians for the first time since the genocide directly. I mean, they've killed in Turkey Armenian minority folks, but as an official government act, Turkey could go in and kill Armenians. They deployed drones, Turkish drones that killed soldiers and civilians and so forth, right? How can that happen, right? I mean, it happens again and again and again, right? Former perpetrators go and they're they're able to, anti-Semites or whatever it is, they continue this kind of activity. But this is a huge step, right? Especially in Russia, in a zone of influence of Russia, who supposedly was supposed to protect Armenia. And so when we think about denial, that's the first outcome, is that it's not that it gives way to other genocides. I do think it has a role in encouraging other genocides, but I think that's in a combination with legal and other kinds of impunity. But particularly when we're talking about a perpetrator state and the former victims, it's a very important force in the future ability of that perpetrator state to again victimize the same people. And that's what really worries me, right? So rather than some sort of grand idea about humanity and denial is bad for everybody, which it is, we need to look specifically at trajectories of violence. Stephanie's great work on U.S. boarding schools is a great example, right? That's stuff from the 19th century getting played out in a different way in the 20th century with a different angle, and she's done some great work on the ways in which the methods, even the concept of what's happening changes, but the impetus is still there from before. So the fact that Armenians now, and I would argue this, are in an existential situation. I've written, you mentioned the reparations report, and I had written about 7 years ago with some co-authors that I felt without a reparative process, and I think this is true of most victim groups of genocide, that Armenians had about 50 years of viability left as a global people. This has to do with all sorts of issues of assimilation, the weakness of the Armenian Republic, food security, water, all sorts of things. After the 2020 invasion of what was a historical Armenian territory, I'll be slightly political here, of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, by Turkey and Azerbaijan, who's claiming it as historically Azeri territory. Backstory to that is Stalin, in yet some of his brilliant internal structuring of the Soviet Union, gave this Armenian territory to Azerbaijan so that the Armenians who were there had to worry and be loyal to Moscow because they had the Azeris who were hostile to them running their local communities. But the Azeris then had to worry because they had Armenians in the middle of their country and they no longer could be fighting with Moscow. They needed the favor of Moscow. And this technique actually Stalin pioneered as the interior minister of the Soviet Union. And you see it all over the place and you see it play out. We're seeing Ukraine, we're seeing in many places. This strategy has led to so much violence. Georgia with the Ossetians, Abkhazians, and others in the last 30 years, right? So anyway, this step, I have recently argued, and again, I'm not a statistician or social scientist, so this is my estimate. But given the genocidal rhetoric, and this is what we're seeing out of Turkey and Azerbaijan, explicit, we will eliminate Armenians, dehumanization, calling them dogs, all these kinds of things. We're seeing this now in the last few years. Azerbaijan actually created a war trophy amusement park in which they had like all these sort of images of death and exhibits of like Armenian soldiers being killed. Some of the mercenaries, probably the mercenaries, about 2,000 or so jihadi mercenaries were imported by Turkey from Syria and Libya. And they carried on the ISIS tradition of beheading videos of prisoners of war, Armenians prisoners of war, and even like an old guy who was just sort of in a village was a very famous video that came out a couple years ago. When you see this kind of agenda, which again, as I said before, was embedded in a lot of elements of the Turkish state, and particularly the military, sort of reactivated, more than 100 years after the original genocide, that's where we start to really worry. That's where we start to think, wait a minute, genocide doesn't go away until we do something. The second outcome, and I will stop here and promise 1 minute. The second thing I'm gonna suggest is that we may be moving past denial into something else. And I just published something that came out, I think, last week on this issue. And I would say if you go back historically, there are really 4 stages of engagement with genocide, post-genocide. You start off, and we talked about the Assyrian Empire, right? With aggrandizement of committing genocide, right? Genghis Khan is a great example, right? They actually had public relations to talk about how fierce they were, how much they could commit genocide. right? And there's some evidence that Assyrians, who are kind of known for these incredibly great conquests and killing people and so forth, that they actually exaggerated that or fabricated some of that to intimidate enemies, right, in the ancient world. So genocide, far from being something people didn't want to be associated with, was something they celebrated as a demonstration of power in a world where maybe that was a part of their survival or out of fear for others. And then you go through a long period. I think you still have that, and you can see some of that even into the sort of early modern period. But you also have omission, which is a very significant force, and I think that really lasts into the 20th century, where we just don't talk about it. Native Americans, they're just gone, right? And we even see this in contemporary accounts of US history. Leah Greenfeld's 1992 Nationalism, 5 Roads to Modernity, I believe it was called, which is one of the worst propaganda tracts I have ever read, and it was celebrated when it came out. Has about a 100-page history of the United States. And there's one mention of Native Americans in that entire thing. And there's all about pioneers settling the West, all this kind of stuff. It's not even that the elimination of Native Americans is rationalized. They're just gone. And the whole terra nullius, the idea that there just wasn't anybody here, even though there were probably like 10 million Armenians in the continental, Native Americans, sorry, Freudian slip there or something when we associate different groups, in the continental United States by some estimates, right? Just gone. Typical feature of U.S. history. You can look at a lot of ways. It happens in a lot of societies. Japan has done this with its atrocities during World War II and so forth. So omission worked well. And I mentioned before that the first phase of Turkish denial was really omission, just not talking about, not letting anybody else talk about it. Okay, what happened? But it's really post-World War II, and I think consciousness of the Holocaust, the definition of genocide, the UN Genocide Convention, Lemkin's activism, which really, we can't overestimate how impactful that was, changes the dynamic, and then we have active denial. What I think we're starting to see is a shift. Denial is now known. And the tools of fighting denial have become fairly developed. Okay, if you look at work people have done, there's work on the psychology of denial. There's work on the logical fallacy of denial. There's great historical work refuting denialist falsifications about history and so forth. So denial is harder to complete now, even though it can be very effective. We'll remember Goebbels, just keep telling the lie, and deniers love to recycle stuff that was discredited 5 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever. They just keep throwing it out there to keep the kind of stalemate going. But what we're seeing is a new move. Azerbaijan particularly has used this, and now we're seeing Russia do it. We've seen it with white nationalists. Oscar, and I forgot his last name, but the great speaker this morning had some allusions to Trump and the sort of Trumpist movement in the US of white supremacy. We see claims of genocide against white people in the US and in other places. And we're starting to see other cases of this. And this is what I'm going to call genocide fabrication. And this is where perpetrators or those in positions of power make false claims against victim groups they're against, that they're the ones committing genocide. This has happened historically. It certainly happened against Native Americans. It's happened in other cases. But typically it was part of a strategy of denial. It was to destabilize claims of that victim group. Now what we're starting to see is it's a super smart move, because what it does is it puts the victim groups in the position of looking like deniers. And so when they respond to false claims of genocide, the only way to do that, honestly, is to say some of the same things that deniers say. The difference being when victims are saying it about a false genocide, they're stating facts. They're correct in what they're saying. Whereas deniers, true deniers, right, Holocaust deniers and so forth, are not stating facts, and their logic is flawed and so forth, but they look the same. And this becomes a powerful, powerful tool. And you see these groups, for instance, Azerbaijan has an active program in the United States. You see it's actually taken off in North Carolina. It was in Maine. It's had some success. It's tried in Massachusetts and Boston to get proclamations claiming that Armenians had committed genocide against the Azeris. Okay, and if we look at Putin, what is one of the main justifications for the invasion of Ukraine. Stopping genocide, right, of the minority Russians, right? Neglecting to point out that the Soviet government, right, which was, I won't say a Russian government, but it was certainly Russian dominated, and the animosity towards Ukrainian national identity certainly had a Russian nationalist component, even though it was housed in kind of Soviet outlook, actually did commit a genocide in the 1930s in Ukraine with the specific goal of stamping out Ukrainian national identity, right? I mean, it was just very clear. And so we're starting to see that shift, right? White supremacists. Oh my God, now they've been told they're the victims, right? The perpetrators, right? They're getting there's all this historical evidence. So what do? You claim you're the victims and start making up this idea that you're actually being targeted for genocide, right? And at the very least, it takes away the power of real victim groups to be able to name the oppressive structures that they're struggling against. Because when they do that, they have to do it through denial, through what looks like denial of false claims. I'm going to stop there because I've overstayed my welcome, but I appreciate your attention.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Henry, for your talk. And this is the point here, right? We're bringing together different scholars of different genocides to think about similar phenomena and what we can identify they might have in common, and in this case on memory and denial. So if Henry focused mostly on Armenia, but gave us many other examples, Timothy Langille, my own colleague here in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, is a specialist in Jewish history, memory studies, trauma studies, and genocide studies. He teaches courses on the Hebrew Bible, Jewish history, and genocide. He has a book manuscript in preparation, which is entitled Memories of Imagined Genocide in the Book of Joshua, Narratives of Destruction and Purification from Antiquity to Modernity. And today he will speak a little about a piece that he recently published in The Conversation about how future generations will remember the Holocaust. So welcome. Thank you, Tim.
All right, thank you. Actually, I'm gonna. Timekeeper there. All right, thank you, Henry, for opening it up with that outstanding talk and laying the groundwork. As Volker introduced me, I'm more of a memory person than someone who works on denial. There will be a little bit of a sprinkling of denial in this, but we got an authority right here next to me, so I'll cover the memory. So there's a few questions I want to raise today is, how do we commemorate the Holocaust in a time of ubiquitous denial, right? Climate change, history, historical facts, election results, other social phenomena, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, Henry, with what Turkey's done with denial, using the same firms that were used to deny tobacco, the association between tobacco and cigarettes in the 70s, oil companies used in the 90s with climate change and fossil fuels. And, so there are some real mechanisms of denial, and we're all alive right now. What a time to be alive. Never thought 2022 would look like this with, social media disinformation, denialism. So in this age of denialism is also a time, as I said, social media disinformation, rising anti-Semitism, and waning knowledge of the Holocaust, and importantly, aging survivors, right? Because we really are getting to the intergenerational, like how we remember is going to be very important with our aging survivors. So I'm going to start by discussing a few popular surveys, a couple Pew surveys on Jewish identity, and then also a recent one on Holocaust knowledge with millennials and Gen Z. I'm Canadian. I've dropped the U from a lot of my spelling, but I'm going to keep Z. You all call it Z for the most part, but I'm going to stick with my Z. That's some Canadian identity I'm going to be keeping. So when you hear that, that's what that means. So when Pew Research released their study of American Jews, a portrait of American Jewish Americans in October 2013, this really caught my eye. I was admittedly surprised by the results, especially in the response to the question, what does it mean to be Jewish? According to the Pew data, 73% of respondents identified with remembering the Holocaust to be an essential part of what it means to be Jewish. Not only did this place remembering the Holocaust ahead of what we would consider, again, religious studies scholar here, the more traditional tenets of Judaism, including being part of a Jewish community, that was only 28%, observing the law, 19%, keeping kosher, 14%, but also it represented a primary identity marker for Jews in the study. So as someone who's worked on memory and trauma and looking at some theoretical aspects of how trauma can really shape and form identity, Jeffrey Alexander's work amongst others, this caught my eye. And comparably, in Pew's 2017 study, American and Israeli Jews, twin portraits from Pew Research Center surveys, 65% of Israelis also had remembering the Holocaust as, quote, an essential part of what it means to be Jewish. As in the previous study, remembering the Holocaust performed as a primary identity marker for Jewishness for Israeli Jews. And there were some real cleavages between Israeli and American Jews in this study, but remembering the Holocaust was not one of them. So let's fast forward, got to stay on top of things. And the study I taught this past fall was in May 2021. The Pew Research Center released their study, American Jews in 2020. And this covered a wide array of things, including Trump and politics, rising anti-Semitism, race in America. You know, Jews do find that anti-Semitism is rising, but they do think that anti-Black in general, anti-Black racism is a much larger problem, anti-Asian racism. But this actually found that 76% of Jews, up from 72%, said that remembering the Holocaust is an essential part of what being Jewish means to them. And citing these studies, might have been good to have a PowerPoint. I can give out my email and pass these studies on to anyone who would like them. But so yeah, just for, you know, they break it down by Jews by religion, Jews by no religion. Henry, I'm like you, I can talk for 3 hours and I will do no such thing. But so I'm not going to break down the issues with the Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, but just kind of descend down this list of the net Jewish. So we have remembering the Holocaust, 76%, leading an ethical and moral life, 72, working for justice and equality in society, 59, being intellectually curious, 56, continuing family traditions, 51, caring about Israel, 45, having a good sense of humor, 34. That one dropped by 10%. So I remember when it popped in 2013, Haaretz had an article saying, because it was caring about Israel is 45%. And I think, no, actually, it was 45, 44. I forget which it was. Caring about Israel and having a good sense of humor. And Israeli Jews were like, thanks, American Jews. We're happy you care as much about humor as us. But, you know, but being part of a Jewish community, 30%, kosher, 20, observing Jewish law, 15. So it's significant how much remembering the Holocaust is for, you know, there are issues with this study, and I'm not going to get into all that either, with these Pew studies. So September 16th, 2020, the Claims Conference, their conference on Jewish material claims against Germany. They released their first ever 50-state survey on Holocaust knowledge of American millennials and Gen Z, and found the following. A significant number of young adults in the US cannot name a single concentration camp or ghetto, believe that that Jews caused the Holocaust, and 2 million or fewer Jews were murdered. 36% thought that. 63% of respondents did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered. The states with the lowest scores, Arkansas, followed by Delaware. Arizona was at 67%. And I'm going to get to Arizona as we're here. Arkansas was at 69%. So Arizona is right at the top with 67%. 48% could not name a single one of the more than 40,000 concentration camps or ghettos. And disturbingly, 11% of the respondents believe that Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. New York was at 19%. Then we go to Tennessee and Louisiana, Montana at 16, Arizona at 15. So Arizona does not fare well in this study. 23% said they believed that the Holocaust was a myth or had been exaggerated, or they weren't sure. And I'm not going to get into the laundry list of how states fared with that, but turning briefly to Holocaust denial and distortions on social media, the Claims Conference study found that approximately half, 49%, of US millennials and Gen Z, quote, have seen Holocaust denial or distortion posts on social media or elsewhere online. And this is something I stopped battling long ago on Facebook. There's a blood libel page, or there used to be one on Facebook, and I'd report it and they'd just be like, no, doesn't violate it, but a woman breastfeeding, you report that, that'll be taken down in a hot second, right? So, so this was actually people trying to document blood libel cases in real time. So 30% of the respondents across all 50 states indicated that they had seen Nazi symbols on their social media or in their community, and we've had that on campus here. And, Nevada led that, and Arizona and Texas were at 64%. So New York was at 67, Nevada at 70. So the survey does note that one consistent bright spot was Holocaust education, what I'm going to get to momentarily, that 64% of all US millennials, quote, and Gen Z believe that the Holocaust education should be compulsory in school. And quote, 80% of all respondents believe that it's important to continue teaching about the Holocaust in part so it does not happen again. So with some of the less encouraging numbers we've seen in Arizona, I'm happy to report that the Arizona Department of Education has mandated, quote, students to receive instruction in Holocaust and other genocides at least once in their grade 7 or 8 grade, and at least once in high school. So this seems like a good thing. And Volker, myself, Jason, Cheryl, a number of us were on the task force for this. And, it's admittedly Holocaust centric, but we also included Native Americans, indigenous people, especially of Arizona, Bosnia, Rwanda, Armenia. But also I remember when this story, and it was a rare moment of bipartisanship in Arizona, but also that day, state of Arizona pushed back hard against critical race theory. Right. So how is this helpful, right? To mandate this kind of education, but then shut down critical race theory. I get to that momentarily. So as Yom HaShoah approaches on April 28th, and fairly recently, January 27th, we had International Holocaust Remembrance Day. One may ask, what is the social function, the function in the present for these days of commemoration? Why is International Holocaust Remembrance Day for the UN and in 39 different countries? And again, another question is, why do so many Jews, according to the Pew Research, identify remembering the Holocaust as a primary identity marker? So as someone who does teach Jewish studies and memory and trauma, Carlos has taken classes with me, and we talk a lot about the past and the present, and how the present shapes how we represent the past, talk about the past. Henry was laying it down good with, a lot of, how these things get embedded structurally in societies, right? And how genocidal societies will have these at a core. And we can see this, with especially Black and Indigenous people in America, critical race theory, right? That these are not things that people like talking about. It's easier for us here to confront the Holocaust, bad guys over there, that happened in the past, compared to something structural and ongoing in the present. So, yes, I try to stress with my students like how, and trauma can be intergenerational, which we're talking about with aging survivors and 2G, 3G, 4G, and, socially mediated. And even the days that get established for commemoration, have meaning. For the UN establishment of International Holocaust Remembrance Day and the Israeli Knesset's choice for Yom HaShoah shows the way, how these days are remembered. Because January 27th, as I'm sure many know, that's a date that the Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the UN selected this day accordingly. And not only does this date commemorate the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, but the Holocaust trying to, people intend to use this for education and prevention. I'm quite cynical about that. I'm going to get to that momentarily, but it reveals our commemorative practices because, since 2010, this day of commemoration has been used to speak to contemporary issues in the present, like survivors and lessons and legacies for future generations. That was a theme in 2010. Experiences of women, 2011, children in the Holocaust, 2012, individual and groups who rescued victims in 2013, deportations to liberations in 2014, and on and on and on. So, this is used as kind of a platform, and we just had a Holocaust Educational Foundation Regional Institute here at ASU, and we talked a little bit about this with Jason and I in our comparative genocide presentation with the what people say is the uniqueness of the Holocaust, or how we use the Holocaust to measure atrocities and genocides and elsewhere. And if it doesn't look like the Holocaust, it can be dismissed as something otherwise. And as Henry said, there's different techniques of destruction. You can't just have these phases of genocide that they're going to play out like in these however number of stages. But so living in an era of unprecedented refugee crisis, which is higher than post World War II, and with crimes against humanity in Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, ongoing genocides against Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, the modes of commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day has been connected to ongoing crimes against humanity and other human rights violations. But despite the good intentions of using the past to speak to these issues of the present, the effectiveness of these lessons are questionable. With some 39 nations commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day, nationalism, closing border, exhibiting hostility to refugees and immigrants, and especially Black and brown ones, those of color. So it's kind of hypocrite, like we commemorate this day, but at the same time, some of these countries are closing their own borders. We can see that here, in fact. And even that mantra of never again to commemorate it. But, since then, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Myanmar, right? So it can come across as very performative, platitudes. And even, the present shaping the commemoration of Yom HaShoah, which is coming up, and I'm going to be speaking at Temple Salel for their Shabbat service around Yom HaShoah on this. Saul Freelander told us that, quote, the Knesset committee dealing with the issue declared that the date was chosen to commemorate the heroism of the ghetto fighters, its closest possible commemoration to the date for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as well as the massacre of Jews by the Crusaders, quote, the forefathers of the Nazis. Boaz Cohen has also said Israelis have institutionalized this master narrative of resistance into a national narrative by placing Holocaust education into the hands of ex-fighters and integrating the ex-fighters into their stories and, academic world. And, we got Joshua Shane just came in here. We've got an expert on anti-Semitism and, a lot of these things, and Zionism and masculinity, right? The muscle Jew, Max Nordau, how that plays out and how Israelis really played up resistance. And especially, there's other forms of resistance, writings, resistance when people are trying to destroy you. But the armed resistance, right? Israelis really played that up and emphasized that in their education, their Holocaust memory. And that's how we get Yom HaShoah. So all these above questions raise questions about the importance of commemoration to non-witnesses. And as Jeffrey Alexander has shown, after enough time passes during a, quote, routinization period, traumatic events and memories can become represented in monuments, museums, and days of commemoration. It's here that where lessons of traumatic past can become lessons for the present and future. And more importantly, to the Pew findings about the degree to which remembering the Holocaust informs contemporary Jewish identities, Marianne Hirsch's work on post-memory has been especially important when we look at intergenerational memory. And by post-memory, Hirsch is referring to, quote, the relationship of the second generation to powerful, often traumatic experience that preceded their births, but that were nevertheless transmitted to them so deeply as to seem to constitute memories of their own right, end of quote. So through this mnemonic process, less directly affected participants can be impacted by the persistence of events that preceded their birth, even after victims and survivors have passed. And Hirsch describes the process of post-memory and the effective impact on descendants of victims and survivors as one in which later generations remember via stories, bodily mannerisms, images, like the photo that Art Spiegelman has Mouse with his brother. And so using a framework of the non-witness, Gary Weissman concludes the following: the second generation, and for now, third generation, will never know what their survivor parents knew in their bones. What the second generation knows better than anyone else is the first generation. And so these are some issues I want to open up, more with denialism, just culturally, this moment of denialism from election results, and just, you know, what we do with all this disinformation that's actually quite effective, right? How many people believe this? How much we've got denialism around us. We've got this moment of aging survivors, and what do we do with Holocaust memory? And also to try and get past like performative and platitudes, because again, I was very happy with this passing, this mandate in Arizona, but when I got the email about that, I remember I was actually in Poughkeepsie, New York, visiting a friend, and my phone dings, and I'm like, oh, and we tried to kill critical race theory on the same day. So, you know, how's that helpful? And, you know, being on Indigenous land now, I'm going to turn it over to you, Stephanie, because I think this will, we can pick up with from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. I think we're starting to have a conversation between us, three different scholars of different topics. And while Henry, I think, gave us an appreciation of the fact that denial isn't static, but denial evolves into different stages, right? He argued that it was quite common in the past to boast about genocide, then it was an omission, then denial, and now perpetrators resort to fabrication in order to wipe themselves clean of their deeds. So, but I think Tim gave us an appreciation of the fact that memory too isn't static, that it involves as well, and that we are in a particular moment right now where on the one hand side, the survivor generation will perhaps not be with us for very much longer, and we are in desperate need to pass on knowledge to younger generations. And despite great efforts, we're not always very successful in this, as the studies that Tim cited show. So to this conversation, I'm very happy to add another voice, Stephanie Kunze from Northern Arizona University. She has already graced this conference with a wonderful talk this morning about Native American boarding schools. Just to introduce her, Stephanie holds a PhD in political science and is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Northern Arizona University. She specializes in perpetrators of genocide and ethnocide, Native American history, and political, societal, and social challenges. Her current work is focused on perpetrators of ethnocide in Native America, as well as policy responses to pandemic-related needs in tribal communities. Welcome, Stephanie. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. So most of you have heard from me already today, so I'm trying not to duplicate what I've been talking about, and thank you to my co-presenters for setting this up beautifully. So you covered all the bases. Originally, when I was approached about talking at this panel, I suggested, hey, shouldn't you be having some Indigenous voices here? And as I understand, a lot of folks were reached out to and weren't available. So here I am. And I just want to acknowledge that then. Speaking of denial, especially in relation to Indigenous peoples, it would be ideal to hear from Indigenous people. So I hope I'm an acceptable second choice. And as I was preparing for this, I was thinking or trying to think of one example, and I had just given a talk about Thanksgiving. So I would like to talk to you about Thanksgiving as a form of forgetting, denial, or loss of memory. And perhaps I will mention some things to you didn't know yet. So this really fits in with my previous co-presenters here because, you know, Tim and Henry both talked about denial and omission. Textbooks came up, how Indigenous peoples are basically not present when you look into textbooks across the country, including Arizona. And last but not least, the holidays that we celebrate. So when we think about Thanksgiving, what comes first to mind is, oh, we're celebrating this football. Football. Yeah. So we have, you know, some American things, but there's also this idea of celebrating settlement or the collaboration between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag or the Indigenous peoples of the East Coast. And I always teach a class to my students every semester. I'm trying to, even when Thanksgiving is not in season, and I ask them, so what is Thanksgiving to you? What do you talk about or think of when this holiday arrives? And it's without exception, family, food, turkey day, spending time with people that we care of. And we also know that Thanksgiving is one of these holidays that is the most important to American society, especially, you know, I would say maybe ranks somewhere near Christmas, but compared to all other religious holidays or holidays in general, Thanksgiving is by far the most important. That's when I can rely on my students to disappear and not come back. So anyway, so looking at Thanksgiving from that perspective, the next question often is, well, is it a Christian holiday or is it a secular holiday? And again, there are different perspectives on that. You may have Christian contingents who say, oh yeah, this is a Christian holiday. We are actually celebrating God and how God provided for the settlers or society after that. Others say, no, it's a secular holiday, has nothing to do with church. It's really just about celebrating our Indigenous peoples and their assistance for the settlers or pilgrims as they came over. So now what few students, or I assume few people in general don't know is, hold on, that was a weird sentence. What people in general don't know is that this whole idea of celebrating the pilgrims is pretty much a fabrication. And I'm sure you guys know that, but so I'm just to throw some dates and numbers at you, or maybe we'll just first start with what we do know. First of all, Thanksgiving is in November. It's the fourth Thursday in the month, right? There's football, there's lots of food, it's Turkey Day, right? And we know that it's really important, and children in school learn still to make these little hand turkeys and the funny hats, the pilgrim hats and all this kind of stuff. But what we do not know is that the first time, well, first of all, that event that we're celebrating occurred in 1621, so long time ago. However, the first time Thanksgiving existed on record that I know of is 1789, so a long time later. And at that time, Thanksgiving was considered a public Thanksgiving and prayer day it's instituted by President Washington to somehow reunite, bring families together. I'm not sure what the full motivation was for that. Then in 1846, a poet, publisher, editor named Sarah Josepha Hale, also known for creating Mary Had a Little Lamb, she came across the story of the Pilgrims having this first Thanksgiving or this gathering with the Wampanoag tribe. So she looked into that, or she really read about it, got fascinated with it, and suggested this is something that we should be celebrating. This should be our Thanksgiving. So I have not actually heard her reasoning, but I assume that it went like this. And she lobbied hard. She lobbied the US government. She lobbied policymakers, politicians. She had this whole magazine she was editing focused on Thanksgiving, how to make pumpkin pies and how to make turkey. Nothing had anything to do with this actual Thanksgiving event, but was something that she was creating and pushing hard. So 1846 is Sarah Hale. Then in 1863, so roughly 20 years later, President Lincoln declares a Thanksgiving holiday to celebrate the Union Army's win at Gettysburg. So again, to bring people together, no mention of Indigenous peoples or pilgrims or any of the likes. And then 1941, 80 years later, President Roosevelt declares a Thanksgiving holiday, which was more about celebrating the end of the Great Depression and bringing again families together. And the story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag slowly becomes part of the story. So there was a lot of back and forth about whether it's the third Thursday or the fourth Thursday, but ultimately the fourth Thursday won. And in return for the shortened Christmas shopping period, we Americans received Black Friday. So now we have Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday in November every year. So at which point did we actually decide that this is about the first gathering between the Wampanoag and the settlers? So somewhere in the last 80 to 100 years, that story became part of Thanksgiving. What really happened, there was a great article in the Washington Post just in November, I think a day before Thanksgiving, where they were visiting some of the Wampanoag representatives and cultural educators who were once again unraveling how the story really went. And according to their records, 2 years in after the arrival of the Pilgrims were having a celebration. They were celebrating their harvest and doing a Thanksgiving type gathering, but no one had invited the Wampanoag or the local indigenous population. They were alerted by celebratory shots fired into the air, went over there assuming that there was maybe some sort of conflict, and found that the settlers were simply having a feast and were at that point invited over and participated in this Thanksgiving event. So I could go into this in a whole lot more detail, but really what I wanted to point out is that holidays, things that have become so important to society, the most, I would say almost most important holiday in the United States, is an active event of forgetting and eradicating an actual history. Not only is it commemorating something that didn't happen in that way, it was also created or put together after the fact. It's something that we have come to celebrate, and when we celebrate it, it's not even the accurate history. So it is a kind of an imagination fabrication of our history. So yeah, with that, we could go into all kinds of different discussions about memory and what really happened in ethnocide and cultural genocide and so on and so forth. But I would like to leave that for our panel to debate, and we'll stop talking now. So thank you very much.
So when we are responding, can I ask the panelists to use the microphone that's in front of you? And if there are questions in the audience, we'd like to take them first. If not, I can always, I'm very happy to supply questions. But yeah, Joshua.
First of all, thank you. And I'm sorry I can't wait anytime to school and came straight here. You forgot, of course, the Charlie Brown Thanksgiving. But more seriously, I mean, this is really what Eric Hobsbawm was talking about, right? This is the invention of tradition that nation states do to create national meaning and to turn what, what's his name? Robert, whatever his name is, talking about the civil religion of nationalism in the 60s. Robert Bella, thank you. Robert Bella, right? So this is what's happening here, I think, right? That's what we're talking about. Thanksgiving, it seems to me. But and frankly, I didn't hear you at the beginning of the talk, unfortunately. We'll talk about it over coffee, but Holocaust Remembrance, it's doing the same thing in Israel. There's no question about it. When you go to Yad Vashem, and I was a tour guide at Yad Vashem for a year, it was drilled into us to do this, particularly the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And also Aliyah Bet, because that museum doesn't end in 45, of course, it ends in 48. It ends with Aliyah Bet, and with the formation of Israel. So it's a clear meaning being given there.
One thing I did cut from here, speaking of Yad Vashem, right, with Yom HaShoah, and then day of the Remembrance Day for the fallen soldier, and then Israeli Independence Day, you can actually walk that path, right, from Yad Vashem through Har Herzl and the cemetery there to walking out onto the streets for Independence Day.
The panorama of Jerusalem. Yes.
Yeah, when I was last in, actually I haven't been in Israel since 2011. I was there with Vered Vinitsky Sarusi talking about this, who's looked at memory in Israel, and was, telling me, because I was there around that time, just being like, just keep in mind, like when you go to the museum, and I suggest you go to these commemorative events, and you can actually walk the calendar, like the way it's set up in Jerusalem. So like even the practice of that and the performance of that, just with as a tourist, that I got to participate in.
Oh, I think there's a question online.
Yeah, so we have a few questions online. First comes from a person named Kyle Clement, and they ask, what role does the government play in denial? And can we trust documents that perpetrating governments put out about their actions in genocide and ethnocide?
It's a big question. It's a great question. I would start by a very interesting fact for genocide scholars, and this is particularly the case with the Armenian genocide, but I think it's been replicated in other places, where earlier, until maybe a couple decades ago, diplomatic documents were given a pride of place in determining the facts of what happened, and survivor testimony was typically treated as unreliable. And when you think about that, that's an incredible irony, because the political, when you're talking about political statements, reports, things like that, they may be well-intentioned in some cases, they may actually be very accurate, but in a lot of cases, they've got a spin that's very clearly about the political agenda of whoever's writing them. And yes, survivors, I'm not a historian, but historians have to be thoughtful about how they work with survivor memoirs, but that doesn't discount them, the sort of discounting that privileging. So I think that is an issue that I would say. And I think could you say the first part again? I'm sorry, the role of governments in denial? Yeah, that's a great question, and it varies so much. You could argue that in some cases, denial gives voice to general attitudes. Maybe Iran, in terms of the Holocaust, where it's certainly used as a political tool by leaders in Iran, but at the same time may represent a very common attitude in Iran related to anti-Semitism and so forth. In the Turkish case, I would say it's very much a state-driven denial, and what you see is average people sort of poking through that. In many cases, what you'll find is people in Turkey, when you get them alone, will tell you what they know, and they really know something about this genocide history, but they're not going to say it in front of people. I was at a Koch University in Ankara some years ago, with a group of very dissident, formerly imprisoned Turks and Armenians and some others. And we were visiting these two buildings. One is, both of them former Armenian residences from pre-genocide periods that were taken in the genocide, very clearly Armenian architecture. One of them is like characteristic actually of Yerevan, which is not in Turkey at all. So it was clearly not something from Turkey. The Turkish folks that were with me spent about an hour talking to the guards. And at first they were super suspicious. They see Americans come, some of them have Armenian names. They're super suspicious. What the heck are we doing there? But after about an hour, they started opening up a little bit more, and they're like, yeah, we know this is Armenian, these are Armenian houses and things like that. Once they had the sense that they weren't going to get reported back for saying what they were saying. So I think it really varies. I do think that tension between government and people can be very important for pushing change in the society. And I would add that you don't get change from the government down. So a declaration of acceptance of a history by the government doesn't necessarily mean it's going to catch on at the grassroots level. And I would say, as the first speaker today pointed out regarding Trump, we see that in the United States, where the official U.S. history is now even under question at the grassroots level in the U.S. So I'm sorry if that's helpful, hopefully.
So is Turkey, okay, so Turkey seems to be not caving into kind of any international pressure to acknowledge it. And it kind of reminds me of what like Austria is now saying they were the first victim of Nazi, and they were completely complicit in the Holocaust. Right. And so how do you get a country, I mean, I'm assuming Turkey is listening to more of its neighbors than the rest of the world community.
Yeah, I can just say, If you go back a decade, so I referenced being in Ankara. I was actually there twice, 2010, 2015, for conferences. And 2010 was the first time there was an actual conference in Ankara that was not a denialist conference about the Armenian genocide. And let me tell you, the state security forces were there. There were bomb threats. There was all sorts of stuff going on. At one point, passports got taken, and we started to get a little worried. But it was allowed to happen. And then, and that was also the first time in Turkey in general, and this was the focus of my paper, and a couple other people talked about it, that territorial reparations were actually talked about. So that was a big deal. In that period, there was a lot of opening up in Turkey. There was a lot of publishing about the Armenian genocide. What happened was a lot of, and we got a little bit of this from the discussion of the Assyrian genocide. There was a recognition of how many Turks today actually have Armenian ancestors, or basically women and children who are taken, forcibly married, sexually enslaved, and other things during the genocide, which is a big difference from the Holocaust, as people are aware. There was a different ideology that was operating. And there are some estimates that 2 to 4 million Turks today have direct Armenian lineage from the genocide, and they've started coming out. And Sabra Atman talked about that as well with the Syrians, and that had a huge impact. I do think part of that going through 2015, and even at moments, Erdogan was entertaining some discussions about this. It wasn't great, but it was a heck of a lot better than previous Turkish leaders. And so people had hope, but wow, maybe there's some movement here. And then, of course, you get the false coup attempt. I mean, you get all these things that happen, a shift to authoritarianism that's directly linked to, which for me is very disturbing, nationalism and a resurgence of Islamism, which had not been present because of Ataturk and that sort of movement against Islam. And that locked everything down. And so I have not gone back to Turkey. I'm actually worried if I were to go back to Turkey now that it would not be safe. I have friends, some of whom have gone, some haven't. And so the culture has changed a lot. You had a lot of jailing of academics, in part around Kurdish and Armenian issues. And we're seeing now this sort of backlash movement. Does that mean in 10 years that's going to fail? Maybe it will. That's my hope, and that it could.
But even the United States now is under threat from authoritarianism. There seems to be this worldwide,
Sure.
imperialist threat. Thank you.
So, great point.
First question about the state and
I'll is this on? Hello. Okay. Okay. I want to respond to part of what the other question was, and also comment on some of the things that were being said. Oh, I think we'll have conversations going all across each other. But I'm not sure if I can really respond to the state perspective or the state action necessarily, but since I was talking about holidays, one example that came to mind here in the United States is Columbus Day, for instance, right? We have made huge progress to acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day in many places. Even more conservative places have embraced the idea of Indigenous Peoples Day, at least at the same time as Columbus Day. But then we had our previous administration, which went to lengths to make sure that Columbus Day was what was being celebrated that day. So I see sometimes perhaps, political power shifting behind a certain event, trying to re-emphasize that. But I also wanted to mention, because we're hearing a lot about Armenia and Turkey and all these different places, of course, the Holocaust in Germany or Europe. In the United States, we're not in the same place. We're not having the same conversation about Indigenous peoples or what happened to Native Americans. So I'm still, carefully dabbling in whether is it genocide, when is it ethnocide, how do we even, portray this, how can we frame these issues? So we're a long ways behind having these same conversations and answers.
and Theriault was also one of my students, and so I appreciate my students showing up and asking questions. And I'll say this as someone who's not a scholar of Indigenous histories, peoples, but as a Canadian with the unmarked graves, right? People have always been saying they're there. People knew that they were there, and now it's like, shocker! Look at this. No, survivors and families and victims' families have been saying that, and the state didn't listen, and we stopped short of calling it genocide. We went with cultural genocide, got a 94-point TRC, which is great, but nothing's really happening with that when you're talking about perpetrator societies and that social core. how it keeps going, because where do pipelines get built? They go around white communities, right through Indigenous land. Drinking water in Canada amongst Indigenous communities for a G7 country, absolutely embarrassing. And so, you know, what the state does and doesn't do, and again, this is outside my field, but it's a Canadian citizen who, you know, still follows Canadian news, and, you know, what the state has done and what it's recognized, how it's done it. And like, and nobody's surprised. People knew that these were graveyards behind these residential schools. And yeah, and then like ongoing, like the last one in Canada closed in 1996, right?
I think there's another question online.
Yeah, two more. David Banesh writes, will the current pushback against CRT in America negatively impact future genocide teaching in public schools?
I brought it up, I'm not an expert on it.
Well, I'm scared. Okay, I don't know if I can definitely answer the. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I can definitely answer that question. But I teach a lot of ethnic and race and ethnic relations courses, and I teach Native American studies classes. And CRT is clearly part of the framework how we look at the history, look at what happened. It's a theoretical approach. And I always try to explain that to my students, what it actually is and how it's being used. And I don't anticipate it going away, but I think we'll all be different in whether we name it and how we approach it. But it also depends on which state you live in. So I would like these other two to comment on this.
Yeah, it's a great question. And that was my question to Tim, was what effect would that have on Holocaust education? And there's kind of two answers to that. And I'm thinking of, if anybody remembers Frantz Fanon and the Black Skin, White Mass book, despite his misappropriation by the Khmer Rouge, which we don't want to discuss, there's an incident he reports where a professor was telling him, when you pay attention to anti-Semitism, because that's connected to anti-Black racism, and you have to pay attention to that. And Fanon has this great passage where he says, "Oh, I thought he was giving me this incredible vision of universal siblinghood and this grand vision of anti-oppression." And then I realized what he actually meant was the same jerks who are anti-Black racists are anti-Semites as well. And I think what the problem we're probably going to see starting off is the same people who, don't care about the Holocaust or are anti-Semitic are the same ones that are pushing against critical race theory and other things. It's the same kind of mentality across the board. So that's the sort of nuts and bolts one. But I also wonder, and I'm going to ask you that question, when we get rid of things like critical race theory, which is broader than any particular group, do we lose our ability, and maybe that's a link to what's happening with the Holocaust, do we lose our ability to have a framework where we can start, understand at some level and appreciate at some level these historical cases of genocide? So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, and well, I think you brought up some great points in your opening presentation with like education systems, right? Colonialism, and taught like how these things get embedded, right? And when things challenge that, right? And people are trying to maintain these structures. And if you're not going to be confronting the past or having reckoning with past, these textbook controversies and what you can and can't teach, like that's absolutely not helpful for history, genocide studies, preventing future genocides, as you noted, like, genocidal societies, right? Like, and also if a genocide's taken place somewhere before, it's more likely to happen again, as you showed institutionally with Turkey. And I don't want to draw a one-to-one with the American system, but there is, but yeah. And then that is something as a Jewish studies scholar, I'd like to see a bit more anti-Semitism actually being part of these conversations. Because to me, sometimes they're like ships in the night that I think we could, from a Jewish studies perspective and also outside of a Jewish studies perspective, that we could have a more integrative conversation about anti-Semitism and race and anti-Black racism, in this, I think if you're with textbook controversies, if you're telling people what they can and can't learn and how the past should be represented, I don't think that's good for any knowledge production and genocide studies would be part of that.
The Arizona legislature just passed a bill just recently that says you can talk about the Holocaust, but you can't say that the Germans were bad. You can only say that 6 million were killed. You can't make the American government look bad because Native Americans, got murdered. And this is why I'm wondering if, and even though only 16 states in the US have a mandate for Holocaust education, don't you think it's easier for them to pass that? Because that took place in Europe and it wasn't an American, it didn't start with Americans, but the ethno-genocide and the cultural genocide of the Native Americans was on us. And so I'm wondering, and also my husband always says they need to rename critical race theory. The name alone is too controversial. Anyway.
Do you want to?
No, there's a student just trained.
I was just going to subject to spearhead. I think it's hard to fight against that. I think the work threat of rising authoritarianism, clamping down on education, humanity folks all come together, especially now in this one year.
And again, I'm going to refer Henry's opening remarks with, again, that social core of genocidal societies, right? Sports teams, structures, embeddedness, preventing social change. And again, it is easier to say, bad people over there, this happened, we're liberators. And if that fits a national narrative versus rather than confronting one's own past, what's in one's own yard, literally,
Yeah.
That's a big part of it for me.
Also, like noise that we didn't really want to take into strategies moving forward.
Right.
Or there's I think I mentioned to you one of the classes before that there's polling that showing that even after the war, the number of Americans that was again bringing into refugees actually went up after the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, even now in the conditions of camps too. I don't know if there's one report in place. The one so far has been in conditions of starting camps that it's almost as bad as concentration camps, that are not intentionally killing enough food, health care. We put them together with the perpetrators. There are perpetrators from, say, the former Soviet Union that fled west, escaped retribution. We put them together with the
Right.
Yeah, but feel free to respond.
It's less a response to you, more to the previous question, but I wanted to make. So since you brought up, our theoretical lens and whether it will impact how we teach the Holocaust or ethnocide or genocide in general, I don't think that will impact it personally. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's a much bigger topic than just one theoretical approach. So I don't think that there will be a significant issue with this. So just wanted to answer that part from my perspective.
But there's another question.
Actually, right along these lines, it's a good segue from Theriault again. They write, what role does public education standards hold in maintaining or breaking denial, especially in the case of violence against Indigenous communities in the US?
That's a tough question.
Tyler's supposed to be a good student.
Can you repeat the second part, please?
So obviously, what role does public education standards play in maintaining or breaking denial, especially in the case of violence against Indigenous communities in the US? So how does education standards impact denial or not?
Okay, I'll give you my response to that, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. But from my perspective, I do get a lot of students in my classes, so that's where most of my experience with this comes from, who have no idea what happened to Indigenous Americans or that Native Americans are, in quotation marks, still here. So there's a huge lack of information and knowledge, which is leading or contributing to denial, ultimately. So when topics like this are not taught in high school or not taught in middle school, and it is a coincidence that a student enrolls in a Native American studies class, there is, I think, a huge responsibility by our education system in not teaching this history, not allowing students to really understand what happened and what the background is. So then most of these students will take a general education class or a Native American specific class or race and ethnic relations class, something along those lines. and find out that their knowledge or their experiences or what they thought was true or happened is not accurate. So it takes a lot of grappling, a lot of breaking down these preconceived notions and ideas and what the United States is or what settlement is, what colonialism means, and that it hasn't ended. That is the biggest takeaway, I think, that we realize that the colonial efforts or dynamics are still ongoing. And that relates to something that I think Henry and Tim were talking about. So I hope that addresses this question.
This is not quite, it's addressing that topic as well as I think something you had raised, and really picks up on Tim's, I think, very nuanced concerns about the effectiveness of education around the Holocaust and other cases of genocide as well, and what really comes out of that. Like, we have this assumption the more people know about these horrible things that happen, the more they'll sort of automatically be sensitized and against that kind of thing happening around us, right? I do wonder, and again, I'm not a Holocaust expert and not an expert on anti-Semitism, but I do wonder, we have to remember, you're plugging different people into that education, coming in with all sorts of different backgrounds and attitudes. And I do think, I mean, obviously we're going to do this education, we have to, that's the right thing to do, to bear witness to this history and so forth. But at the same time, the way it often happens, and I think you talked about this sort of performative way of doing this, can really backfire, because it also reinforces a notion of these populations that have been targeted as fit subjects or fit targets of violence, right? There's a danger of romanticizing violence against Jews and violence against other groups. And I think that, I'm not sure how to deal with that. I think it's just something, and it's not to stop teaching about this, but when we think of, and we've seen this in the US, even like with school shootings and the tie to anti-Semitism and so forth, this inverted sort of glorification, the sense of, like this machismo of identifying with Nazis as these super powerful, we still see that among disaffected people in the US and so forth. And so looking at the way that public education can impact these issues, when it's not done well, it's really dangerous, because there's a lot that gets loaded into this. So I'll pass that on, and it's sort of a half thought, but maybe something to think about.
Well, the CRTC owes me one for Canadian content today, because I gave you Zed and then all this other Canadian stuff. So I'll continue with that. But my home province of Alberta, there was a new curriculum that people were excited about that had more Indigenous perspectives, and the new, it's not new anymore. When the Conservative government came in, they're like, no, we don't do that. Like, this is insulting whiteness pretty much. And they threw away that new curriculum. And then the Northwest Territories, which tends to use Alberta's curriculum, they're like, we're not here for that. We're actually going to use British Columbia's curriculum instead. And then in some universities in Canada, I forget if it's University of Winnipeg or Manitoba, you need to take an Indigenous Studies class to get a degree. It's now mandatory. It's part of the curriculum, and there is a movement towards that with some Canadian educational institutions. Yes, no, and again with Cheryl's in the room. Cheryl was moved mountains for this, new mandate we had in Arizona, and I think that this is excellent. And I just wish, as you said, it was more broadly applied, right? That, young people were getting access to this and being taught this and other topics. And yeah, we shouldn't be scared to, as you often see on social media, if people are young enough to experience something, right? Like racism, people can learn about it.
Oh, go ahead.
Please go ahead. Yeah, so I just want to build on what you said about America grappling with our own crimes versus other crimes, and also push back a little bit on the issue of teaching the Holocaust from CRT. I love that story of the Arizona legislature. I mean, I don't love it, hate it, but I mean, it's an amazing moment. They were both passed together. And it reminds me of a couple of things. It reminds me of George Mossy of blessed memory, when he came to my classroom in 1994, 1995 and said in a voice that I can't possibly replicate, a wonderful deep voice, he said, why is the U.S. Holocaust Museum being built on American holy ground? right? Why is it being built there at Library Mall? There was no museum of African American history not for decades to come. And why in Charleston, South Carolina, where I teach, was they were built a Holocaust memorial, and I swear it's true, literally in the shadow of a John C. Calhoun statue on Calhoun Street. Like literally that the shadow from the statue was over the Holocaust memorial. And there was no memorial to slavery. 40-some% of all the slave imports to the United States came through Charleston, South Carolina. There's still not, I mean, the building finally is into that final. And it seems to me this issue is very, very important about you know, we can talk about that because it's them and not us, and we can't grapple with our own problems. CRT is just shorthand for the systemic racism and history of the genocide of Native Americans and of African Americans. And it seems to me that you have to teach them together. If you teach the Holocaust, anyone who teaches the Holocaust, I'm sure this is true for you, Tim, didn't revamp their course in 2016. I don't know what planet they're on. I revamped my entire course to teach, instead of one class on fascism, we had 2 weeks on fascism. So that every student in my class knew what fascism was. And it seems to me that if you don't, you know, the whole, I know Never Again has its own history and it's actually grounded in Americana and so on, but in terms of its normal usage, which is to say you can't wait till 1942 to intervene, you have to intervene 1936 or 32 or 20 or something like that. I mean, how can you, if people walk away from a Holocaust class and think Hitler's running executioners and not ordinary men, something has gone wrong. If they walk away saying those Germans are nuts, thank God I'm an American, I think I've lost them. I've failed as a teacher. So you know, I think these things are very, you know, I'm tenured, so I can erase it. I worry about my, you know, Chad Gibbs over the weekend. He's not tenured, and I worry for him. He wants to teach this too, and he has to get tenured. I worry about these ones very, very much.
Yeah, I agree. And fields aren't static. They're always changing, right? Holocaust studies changed in the 90s because of Bosnia and Rwanda. People started talking more about sexual violence. And yeah, 2016 or 2020, if Carlos took a class with me in fall 2020, like that comparative genocide class looked very different than, you know, not that these things weren't happening before George Floyd, but, you know, to not be in the, and this is what students care about. This is what they write their papers on. This is what they want to talk about. Even when I'm teaching otherwise, they're the ones who are drawing analogies. The students aren't scared of analogies.
Can I maybe draw you a little bit back to the kind of comparative aspect of, I mean, how often is it that we have 3 scholars of 3 different genocides on one stage? But it seems to me with memory, right, there's a performative aspect, there's a communicative aspect to it, and there's clearly a kind of a place or a spatial aspect to it. And right now, it seems to me that for the kind of performative aspect, the stage is changing because it's moving into places where old-fashioned people like me are not there. The communication changes clearly. The story, how we communicate the story changes. Tony Fusco with you guys is doing a kind of a TikTok challenge here, right? This is a medium that I would never use. So, right, the stage is changing, the story is kind of changing, but also the place is changing, because we just cannot assume that the place that have a lot of meaning for me, right? If I go to a concentration camp in Germany, this has a very specific meaning for me as a German. I cannot expect that a young person in Germany who probably has a very different background has the same experience. And yet I kind of say, well, that's the entry ticket, right? If you want to be German, that's what you have to buy into. So to cut a long story short, I think for memory, right, the stage is changing, the story is changing, the sites are changing, and we're responding, but much slower than these processes unfold. And likewise, with respect to denial, I think here too, all of these things are changing, and we're so really inept at addressing these changes, which is why fabrication or even old-fashioned plain denial in the form of Turkey. I mean, how dumb is that, right? I mean, just like it didn't happen. You know, even that flies today. So, okay, what is it that we're doing wrong? Why do we not respond adequately to how the story, the stage, and the sites change? And I think that is something that we can talk from all of our lenses, be that Armenia, be that the Holocaust, or be that Native Americans. So that's a horrible question at the end, but if you can grapple with that, I would be honored.
Have someone else start. Do you want? We call those zinger questions, by the way. I feel the same way, but I mean, you're raising a great point, and it's that sense of always being behind, right? Yeah. I think one of the challenges, and you can see this certainly with Armenian genocide denial, which is extremely well funded. You see it in the U.S. around textbook control, because the way that works is particular states, Texas is probably the most significant, really control the content of textbooks for the entire country. Yeah. And so their particular, and legislative action, all this kind of stuff that happens actually then has this reach, across the US. And if you look at even looking at Holocaust denial, which is certainly not German state sponsored, and as I mentioned, talking about state sponsor is complicated. But if you look at the money that's gone into that, right? Thomas Edison's granddaughter funded, I want to say the Institute for Historical Review, but I'm probably wrong about that. Again, reaching way past my expertise. But huge amounts of money, right at a point where, and I think it might have been following the Ernst Zundel case in Canada, right at the point where those fighting against Holocaust denial had figured out, wow, one way to do this is to bankrupt these groups, which are fringe groups that were not well financed. But what do you have? You have rich anti-Semites then funding this stuff, right? And so I think there's a material thing, which is an old material issue, right? So they can pay for trolls on the internet. They can generate all sorts of stuff. They can have the public relations folks that get to, I'll say newspapers. They're not newspapers anymore. They're, internet papers, whatever we want to call them. And that's a really tough thing to fight against, right? Especially because, let's not forget, I don't care how well genocide victim groups have overcome the past. They're demographically much smaller than they would have been. They're always small groups, right? I mean, just look at the number of Jews, Armenians, Native Americans. Native Americans, you're talking 90% or 98% decline in North America, something like that. It's dramatic, right? Look at other groups, right? Just in terms of the number of people, you've got a small group in the amount of expropriated wealth that never was returned and people had to, struggle to overcome. All these kinds of things mean those groups are a huge disadvantage. And I did mention, and there's a kind of normalization of their, I hate to say it, genocide just makes the victims, it really taints the victims, no matter how much we say we care about the victims and all that kind of stuff. I think there is absolutely a taint that comes in. These are weakened people. These are people that don't matter. We can have sympathy for them like the Tasmanians, right? As long as they don't matter, as long as they're basically extinct, we can have all the sympathy in the world. But when it matters, we're not going to do anything. So I think there's a huge challenge there. I'm not sure I think social media is the tool now, but I think it's an existing challenge of power and resources.
And just to add, using your own words, right? It's not only decreased like number, but more likely to be re-victimized as well, right? With, these structures. And if we don't deal with them, and traumatized, like that they're more likely to be re-victimized as well, or be, the target of hate.
Right.
I think it's my honor to thank you guys for your wonderful presentations and input.